Welcome, everyone. I was a teacher for 35 years, so try to use my teacher voice. And I just recently retired. I used to do this 5 times a day. Now I just get to do it randomly. I've been involved in chestnut for about 30 years, and I'll tell you how I got involved in just a second. And I think I'm here at the request of the library and the garden club, right? So I thank you and we like to talk to people who get their hands dirty and actually have been humbled by trying to plant and make things grow, because it's not always that easy, is it? Doesn't always work out the way you expect. All right, so this is our sort of introductory chestnut lecture. I showed you some different names for it earlier, but really it's changed a lot in the last year because the science has changed a lot in the last year. So I am relearning what I used to think about chestnuts too. So we're all in this, we're all learning together here. One thing we have to watch out for is a lot of times we get chestnut tree leads. I hear your garden club has a separate splinter group with tree leads, and half the time it's about horse chestnut, which is not American chestnut. So I just want to throw that out here. Horse chestnut's a different species, but you know, they still have nuts, and kids used to play with them, and that's a lot of the trees. Well, not so much anymore. They're all kind of dying. It was kind of like a town shade tree, but most of those are kind of dying out now. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, and in fact, that's how I got involved, because I was riding around my neighborhood. Actually, I was pushing my son, who's now 30, and I found some chestnuts on the ground. I thought, I found an American chestnut. This is amazing. I'm awesome. I'm going to go eat this and plant it or whatever. It turns out it was horse chestnut. That was how ignorant I was about chestnut trees. So I actually had to go to a library, and I had to look up organizations, and there was a National Geographic magazine that had an article on a new group called the American Chestnut Foundation. So I got involved. So that's how I got involved many, many years ago out of pure ignorance of what is an American chestnut tree. It's not always that easy to figure out when you're in the woods. It looks kind of like a beech tree. It looks kind of like a sawtooth oak. There's a reason they call it a chestnut oak. It looks like a chestnut tree. A Siberian elm, we don't see those too much around here. Chinese chestnut looks a lot like the American. This is what we see, the lower right over there, kind of lurking in the forest, just, like a little shrub, not really a mighty tree. So that's what, it's not always easy to figure out. They're all members of the Fagaceae family, which is the beech family, so there's a reason they all kind of look similar. That makes sense, oaks, beech, chestnut. And the one we're interested in is that tremendous American tree that until 100 and so years ago used to produce timber like that in the Appalachians, or shade trees like that in the lower right. Beautiful lumber. We'll get into that later. All right, so you have to, if you want to know the chestnut story, you got to take yourself back. Imagine yourself arriving here in 1492. There are wolves roving around, there are mountain lions, there are passenger pigeons, there are 4 billion chestnut trees, and only about 5 million people in all of the Americas, right? Fewer than are in Massachusetts. So this is when the story kind of begins. And actually it goes back even further than that. And that is the natural range of chestnut. I hope you can see that's a map of the United States. That's the natural range of chestnut, the dark green. And there's always stories about how a squirrel, do you see the squirrel in the upper right? Yeah. A squirrel could start in Maine and make his way all the way down to Mississippi or Alabama or wherever you decide to end up. But that's sort of true. The range really was, the tree was anywhere between 10 to 30% of the hardwood forest, all up and down there in those dark green areas. And it's likely it actually was even further out here earlier, but a root rot disease kicked it back even before modern times. All right, let's see. Then, come on, let's go. Oh, now, you are here. Again, we all have to remember that if we go back 2,000 years, we would be under an ice sheet. All ice sheet went all the way down to Long Island, totally covered the Cape. So hardwood trees don't survive in this. So all the hardwood trees had to fly down here into the Florida Panhandle and survive in their refugia until the last glaciation started to melt. And it actually was pretty late. Chestnut came back pretty late, almost as late as humans came back up into the Northeast. And we get all this from pollen records. Believe it or not, at the Harvard Forest, they found this nice bog, and they have all these sedimentary layers. And they could figure out what the tree composition was in that area over thousands of years, which is pretty amazing. Just if you don't know, but you're gardeners, so I'm just going to take you through the life cycle, because if you haven't experienced it, it's pretty amazing. Obviously, you get the nut, you get the seedling, you get the tree, you get some kind of pollination, and amazingly, you get these little nuts. But it takes a little while. So let's say last fall we collected a nut, and let's say it actually makes it through the first winter. Actually, that should be spring 20. I'm off by a year. But anyway, next spring it's growing. And then in about, 7 years, it looks kind of like a small tree. And then in 15 or more years, it's a big tree. And it happens to be next to another big tree. And then it starts to cross-pollinate. And then before you know it, you get actual nuts. But it's a fairly, kind of a long time frame, especially in the forest. In our orchards, we can get them to grow nuts in like 8 years. But it's not a quick life cycle. And so just the nut itself is pretty amazing. It's everything wants to eat it, everything. We've had raccoons, turkeys, squirrels, everything eats the nuts. So it's very hard once they're out there. They know they're there, and of course that's all the genetic information from the mom and the dad, which is pretty amazing. And the thing about a chestnut tree is it produces a huge mast crop every year. Almost, even if there's a drought, it's a very regular producer. It's not like some trees which try to fool the wildlife, where they have a mast year and they throw out all this stuff and then they wait 3 years and try to starve everyone off. It just sends out almost the same amount of nuts every year. So you can imagine how important it was to the little critters besides humans. And the nut itself is pretty amazing. It's got sugars in it, and if a squirrel buries it just a little bit, it stays just about freezing all winter. And once it stratifies, it settles out, then it will sprout in about 40 days. So the sugars are like an antifreeze in it. And then amazing thing, when you're trying to keep them until April in your fridge, all of a sudden in January, in your fridge, you'll see these little radicals coming out. That's their root. And then the amazing thing is, from the root, the little stem comes up. Later on, you get your little chestnut tree. You can even see the first couple leaves. And then, if you're lucky, you get a seedling. I actually have seen some real seedlings out in the forest that they're not associated with another stump. They're really from it. You can actually feel the seed usually. And that's, May through June. And then if everything doesn't eat it, like moose, we've had moose, we've had deer, whatever, then it starts to flower in 4 to 10 years. But what we see in our forest is something like this. It might get to 10 or 15 feet scraggly, then it kind of dies back. And it often dies back before it has a chance to send out flowers or nuts, which is bad, because then the tree can't, deal with its problem. It just keeps having the problem. Yeah, let's see. Oh, there we go. And if you're lucky, as I said, you get to a tree size. Believe it or not, that picture on the right is the tree at Quabbin that I pollinated. That's about 65 feet tall. Of course, it's dead now, but that's what you want. You want 2 of those, and then, because they have to cross-pollinate. And then the amazing thing is these, hopefully with this crowd, I can say pipe cleaner. You know what a pipe cleaner is? With a younger crowd, my son would look at me like, what's that? Well, these they're called catkins, and flowers. And then over here, the female is that little fuzzy little pineapple thing that eventually is going to have the nuts in it. And the little pollen, the anthers on the end of the pipe cleaners float around, and they're very tiny, and it's amazing. I can't believe the whole thing works, but it seems to work, because I've done it myself a few times. Yeah, the pollen grain is only like 15 microns across, so you can't even see it. So we're up there in a bucket truck, with pillboxes sloshing around this junk that we can't even see, trying to make crosses, but somehow it works. I don't know. Nature finds a way, right? And then in September, just around end of September, early October, the nuts start bursting open. And you can see they have their own squirrel protection, which, if you ever tried to pick one of these up, they're very painful, right? Very unpleasant. That's why they probably might not make the best shade tree for a city, but let's pretend, we won't tell them that. And then, of course, in October, you get your huge amount of nuts. So what's the importance of this thing? Let's talk a little bit about it. Obviously, so a big tree is producing 150 pounds of food. So you can imagine what that did for all the wildlife, not to mention the humans, and everything ate it. And over on the right there, if you can see the oak tree, everywhere now you see an oak forest. The chestnut outcompeted it and was about 20 feet taller. So now that oaks are the canopy tree. Chestnut used to be the canopy tree. So that's the way it happened. And of course, Native American chestnut culture was huge. They used it for their houses. They used it for canoes. They had used it for medicine. And as it turns out, as I've kind of done my research on both Native Americans and chestnut, they almost spread up into the northeast woodlands at the exact same time. So maybe they needed chestnut to come up here. I don't know, or chestnut needed them. I'm not sure. Yeah. So obviously, if you can store this little magic nugget of protein and eat it in the winter, it's pretty amazing, which you can. The bark is great. The wood was good for canoes. And I already mentioned the medicinal qualities. Some people use the leaves for colds, and you can make tea out of it. And also, all right. Oh, one of my ancient ancestors, William Bradford of Plymouth, when he got here, they said there is much good timber, both oak, walnut tree, fir, beech, and exceedingly great chestnut trees. Even right away, they noticed that these are not like the ones in Europe. These are huge. So they were pretty amazed. And of course, then, as Europeans came over, they started, making things, using it for lumber, firewood, etc. And, it was a pretty important colonial building material. The thing about chestnut is it's one of the strongest strength-to-weight ratios of any wood. So that's why in some of your houses around here, I'm sure that some of the main beams might be chestnut because it will carry a lot of weight but doesn't weigh a lot, if that makes any sense. And it also is naturally rot resistant. So they used it for fence posts, stakes, and they used it for shingles, they used it for siding, all sorts of things. So it was a pretty valuable wood, and they used it even in like fine furniture. I haven't seen a lot of this myself personally, but I know they made that's for a schoolmaster to teach with a little like presentation box made of chestnut. And in the South, they used mostly the bark, but also even the wood, to make the compound that they got the tannin from the bark that later on is used in leather production. So in the South, they had huge factories extracting the tannin, making tannin extract, and then they used the chestnut for pulp afterwards, for paper pulp. So it was a huge industry. And they even started, especially after the blight, they started using them for telephone poles. So they would treat them lightly, but generally there's a Cape Cod chestnut pole that's still in service today with one of our board members standing in front of it, still in use from 1928. So it is fairly rot resistant. All right. So most of us have kind of lost this chestnut culture. Previous people, not even that long ago, always knew in the fall, that was the time you went out with your friends and you gathered chestnuts. You went chestnutting. So you'd go out and you'd bring blankets and you'd make a day of it. Or there are all sorts of letters from the 1800s about people going out for a date, going chestnutting back in the fall of like 1860. And then in the cities, they would bring in, sometimes these weren't always the American nuts, they might have been the European nuts, but they certainly are European nuts. Now they would sell them in the cities in the fall. And did you know that chestnut was good for the brain? There you go. That should. And then, of course, around here and even in the South, in the fall, you got to fatten up your livestock, and then you drive them into the cities to be slaughtered, like into Alston. You drive them into the stockyards in Alston. The drove goes along Route 20, for a certain. But anyway, it was really important in fattening up your animals. And in the South, it was probably up here too. It also gave a little income to families that needed it, so they could sell the nuts to the cities and buy shoe money. All right. Then, of course, it happened. In 1904, all of a sudden they noticed that the big American chestnut trees at the New York Botanical Garden were sick. Something was wrong with them. They started getting this canker on their bark, and everyone didn't know what to do about it. And they had to give it a name, and that's when all the blight started. And then within 50 years, almost every single tree in that whole range you saw looked like this. There seemed to be no natural immunity to the blight at all. So it was truly a pandemic. It wiped out, I don't think no one has found any 200-year-old chestnut trees anywhere. They all died in some way or form. And if you want to know what this thing is, the blight is it's a fungus. It's a bark fungus. It was imported from Asia, probably on nursery stock in the late 1800s. And it probably had multiple introductions, but what it does is I don't know if you can see here, but it kind of makes the bark sink in and turn red. You can even see the little spores, and wherever it is here, it's really doing damage further along the tree. So it totally girdles the tree, so it can't get any nutrients up to the top. And you can see over here, this is what we do. This is what we've been doing for 30 years. We grow the trees up until they're big enough, then we try to kill them with 2 forms of the blight. And that's why you see 2 cankers on this, but that's a story for another day. So if you want to, you can grow this like in science class in a petri dish if you want, and the official term. The Latin term is Cryphonectria parasitica, if that means anything to you. All right, and this is what we're used to in the forest, right? We're used to these kind of dead sprouts, little shrubs, nothing really, generally, if you see a flower, you're pretty lucky. So we consider them functionally extinct. Even though they're still out there, there are probably some within 2 minutes of here. If we went out, they just don't grow up big. They've been resprouting for almost 100 years now. They keep resprouting from the root collar. And I was wondering, why did this happen? And then someone said, well, when the trees were starting, the continents were connected. But as the tree species had already started, and then we started spreading out, you got a huge amount of separation here between US and Eurasia. And in Eurasia, the blight was present, and they had to deal with it much longer. These trees never had a chance to deal with it at all. So that makes a lot of sense. I asked this stupid question once, so I thought I'd answer it. If you look at a map, these are the 4 major kinds of chestnut trees: American, European, Chinese, and Japanese. And it makes sense that the Chinese and the Japanese are better at dealing with the blight. Europeans are okay, because at least they keep fighting, but they seem to be able to survive. Seem to have absolutely no resistance to it at all in America. All right. So obviously scientists tried to stop this early on, and they knew that Chinese and Japanese trees were pretty resistant. They would not all die. And so they started making hybrids, and the United States Department of Agriculture tried hybrids. The Pennsylvania Blight Commission, they would like cut down 2-mile channels in the forest to try to keep the blight from jumping from one part of the forest to the other. Of course, it's a mold spore, and it didn't make any difference. So, but they tried foaming trees and burying them. They tried everything. Connecticut Agricultural Station also did a lot of early hybrids. And actually, some of our early Chinese resistance comes from those trees. But anyway, it didn't really seem to work very well. They tried crossing them, but they didn't really have much of a plan. So in a way, science had sort of given up on the chestnut for about 30 or 40 years, until about 1980 or so. There was a corn geneticist, the guy over on the right, Charles Burnham, who was breeding corn, and he thought, well, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to get blight resistance from one species into the other if they crossbreed, because you can back cross, which is the same thing Mendel did when he was trying to get peas he was trying to get the flowers, whatever he wanted, more pink flowers, so he just kept back crossing and selected for the pink flowers. So that's basically what we've been trying to do. It's called the back cross method, but it takes multiple generations, and with a tree it's kind of hard because it takes 4 to 10 years for our trees even to flower in the orchard. So that's the method that we started off, and this foundation was founded on. Now, you see this chart, I know it's not a very good chart here, but when you back cross, you get a huge variety. Just like when you get a Labradoodle, you're getting a huge variety. You might be getting a lot of poodle, you might be getting a lot of Labrador. Well, so the first generation, I'm not going to go through the whole chart, Chinese versus American, then you get an F1, and then you would select for ones that look more American, and you back cross to another American. And then you do that again, and you select for things that look American but have blight resistance. And then you do it again, and you do it again. And that's a 5 to 10 year process for each one. So it's kind of tedious. And it was based on the model that there were 3 genes for blight resistance. So we knew the percentage of trees that should be okay. And there it is again. And we, at our chapter level, we only started in 2000. We came in, so we got pollen and came in at this level, and then we went through this level. We actually are at this level now, which sounds great, except things have changed. So we're on the program. We're creating B3, F3 trees, which is the last thing. Except this is all before genetic testing. And we only could select by trying to kill the tree and like measuring, well, we could measure the cankers. And that's how we tried to figure out how blight resistant it was and whether it died or not. And also, to try to figure out Americanness, we just had to kind of look at leaves and bud break and leaf hairs and growth habit. All these things are very subjective. And that's how we tried to figure out which ones were going to go along in our process. But over the last few years, the Chinese chestnut genome was sequenced and mapped, not completely, but mostly. And then actually that made us figure out what's the difference between this and an American. So basically, we can send a sample off to our lab or another lab and figure out the exact percentage of Chinese and American, which would have been really nice if we could have done that 30 years ago. But we can't. And then there's also a whole new way of small stem assays or tests where they take like a seedling and you just send a leaf to a lab and they take the leaf and they work on the leaf and try to kill the leaf, and then they can sort of judge the blight resistance instead of us growing the tree up to 12 feet high and then trying to kill it. So this is another labor-saving device. But then the genetics have come so far, we pretty much realized that our BC3, F3s, the final stage, they actually, the ones that survived look much more Chinese than they should be, and they had lower resistance than we expected. So something was wrong with our model. What we used to use is called the 3-gene model. Something was up with it. And now the analysis suggests that there are more than 3 genes, probably 9 or more genes that we're trying to select for, which makes it, let's see, I think one of our board members who's very good with math, he said, oh, that means 1 out of 250,000 chance we have of getting it right with the method we're using. So we've been doing this for 30 years, and all of a sudden, whoa, we gotta rethink this. So that's why I said this is why I feel like I'm kind of new to the foundation myself, because everything's changed. So the American Chestnut Foundation, so I think they knew this was coming, and so in 2015 they came out with sort of a 3-burr approach, or because there are usually 3 chestnuts in the burr, but breeding, biotech, and biocontrol. And obviously we want to get there however we can. So we need to continue breeding, back crossing, but we're going to do it in a different way, which I'll explain it to you. And then here's the big, this has got all the press over the last year or so. There actually finally now is a transgenic chestnut tree. At SUNY New York, they've actually put a wheat gene into a chestnut tree that fights fungus. So, but some people are, oh, I'm out, that's it. Other people are, oh, that's interesting. I'm still have an open mind. I'll tell you more about it in a second. And then the last thing is, speaking of the news, hypovirulence. There's actually some viruses attack the fungus and make them less strong. But it's hard to get that right balance, and it's hard to move it around through the forest. But it is possible if you have one tree. Some things do naturally fight the fungus. Also, if you really, it's not a very pleasant or nice looking solution, you can actually pack wet mud around the wounds and the fungus won't live in dirt, wet dirt. That's why the tree just keeps growing up from the bottom. But anyway, so those are the 3 things. And as I said, the transgenic tree, we've gotten a lot of press. I guess all press is good press, right? The tree has gotten a lot of press from Bill Powell's transgenic tree, which he spent the man hours and the lab hours that went into trying to get a seedling like that is pretty amazing. We have a very friendly relationship with him, and he wants to cooperate with us. And this is a terrible slide, but this is what it took over 10 years to get this to work. They have to remove the germ cell from the nut. They use a natural bacteria to get the new gene they want in. It takes thousands of attempts to get it to work. It hardly ever works. Then once it works, it might not be in the right place, or it might not be good for reproducing. So it's a nightmare. So whatever. They've managed to do it though, which is pretty amazing. And chestnut apparently was much harder than other trees to do this with. So it was kind of it was sobering for them that, I mean, other trees, they've done it in 2 or 3 years. It took 10 years for chestnut. And if you just want to know how it works, I stole one of their nice slides here. So that gene from wheat is oxalate oxidase, and somehow that degrades the oxalic acid, which helps to destroy the bark. So somehow it's a natural reaction to making it less, makes the wound less virulent. So there's Buster Blight and Charlie Chestnut. So there you go. And as it turns out, the New York chapter, we have state chapters. The New York chapter has, all they've been doing is they've been saving real American chestnut trees and just waiting for this to happen. Whereas with that, so they haven't even been doing the crossbreeding, which is just another method of going at it. So it's not a magic solution, but at least it's a little hope. So far, all the trees you get are clones, so it's the exact same tree of one event. So you don't want to send the exact same tree out into the environment, right? Then you have a monoculture and one thing can wipe it out. So obviously they'll have to get more versions of it. It takes 3 years to get the seedling instead of 1 year, so it just takes a little time. And it's now going before the 2 regulatory agencies, so the federal government, just so they can try testing. They have done a lot of testing. They've really tried to see, they do things like, do tadpoles react differently to it? Do the tadpoles like those leaves better than the transgenic leaves? And it seems like nature can't really tell the difference. And we have not officially decided we're going to participate in this yet, but that's sort of up to each individual chapter. So that's a big, again, it's pretty amazing, but it's still not the full solution. The cool thing about this is, if the transgenic tree really does come out, if you stick one in the woods with a pure American, half the offspring should get that gene. So you could very quickly spread the resistance in a natural setting. So that's good. So it could be a really quick way of making trees more resistant, which is good. So we've had to ask ourselves, what do we do with our seed orchards, that we're following that very standard plan? Every tree in that orchard goes back to someone up in a bucket truck making that original cross, and you kind of feel like it's, oh, my Hopkinton tree, or oh, my Quabbin tree. I hope that makes it through. So how are we going to save all this? And that's what we're kind of trying to do now. So we've been, as I said, we've been spending all this time on these back EC3 orchards where we take the nuts, we grow them up to be whatever, 10 feet high, and then we try to kill them. That's what we've been doing. So we're going to try to do that more efficiently in our next orchards. And when I talk about mother trees, that's the original pollination. So I just randomly threw some names in here. There's a tree in Lincoln. There's trees all over the place. And so the father was Meadowview pollen that they sent up to us that we were up in the bucket truck doing. So our orchards do represent a lot of, we have 30 different orchards with 60 different mother trees. We have a lot of genetics in our system that we don't want to waste. So this is kind of technical, but we used to keep separate our lines of resistance. This is the Chinese parent, Graves, Clapper, and Nanking, and now we're just going to bunch them all together because we realize that we want more Chinese in a way, which is weird. We spend all this time trying to get rid of the Chinese. Now we have to almost go backwards and get more of the Chinese. We have to go back and get more of the Chinese because that's where and get more of that blight resistance. So it's kind of weird. But now we're going to use genetic testing to test what we grow up, and we're also going to screen the trees at a younger age. And in 3 generations, 15 years or so, we should be able to recapture anything we lost in the other system. So a lot of things we used to do, we're totally changing. So we're changing over all our orchards to be all mixed like this. It's called stacked resistance or spiking the punch, trying to get more action going in there. And also now we know that if a tree, we would have been really happy 2 years if we knew that a tree was 95% American. Now, if it's 95% American, we know that's too much. We got to get rid of it because it didn't get enough of the Chinese into it. So we can cut out those right away. So again, as I said, we probably had a 1 in a 250,000 chance of getting it right with the way we tried. So ironically, we're kind of reverse back crossing now. We're going back up and getting more Chinese involved, which is crazy. Now there's other things that like to kill chestnut. The other big thing is Phytophthora, which is cinnamomone, which is an ink disease, and that's the one that kills the entire root system. And that's in the south. It seems to be in warmer climates, but as you know, if climate changes, it's going to move up or it's going to move back. So we got to be ready for that. So now we're not only testing for blight resistance, but we also have to test for this Phytophthora. Fortunately, there are a bunch of Chinese trees that even have good resistance to this. So again, it's just another variable that makes it hard to get what we want. And but obviously, so that's the big quabbin picture. We're looking to get back to this. How we get there, I'm not exactly sure, but that's the tree in quabbin that managed to be isolated enough to grow up to be 60 or 70 feet. And but unfortunately, I think it got nicked by a skidder, and and also generally the trees that we found and pollinated are dead usually within a year or two, because that's their last, they throw out their last children, and that's a sign that they're about to die, because that's usually when the blight hits them. And to do that, you got to make two trips up in the bucket truck. 3 trips? Oh, 3 trips up in the bucket truck, because you got to close it off before it gets pollinated by any of the other catkins. Then you got to go back and do the control pollination. Then you have to go back and harvest it. So it's 3 trips in them. That's why we have a lot invested in those individual mothers, as I've done 4 or 5 of them, and it's a pain. Anyway, so obviously our goal is to get a tree that would survive anywhere. We're also Rhode Island. Rhode Island is part of our chapter, so they're too small to have their own, I guess. And we just want to be able to have trees that look like American chestnuts that survive and wherever they would have survived in the past. And even if we had a perfect tree, if I brought in a little seedling and said, this is the answer, right? Think of what it really involves. Reforestation, it's a multi-generation project, right? Which will take hundreds of years. A species restoration project like this has never been attempted. Never been attempted. The true performance of some trees in forest situations you don't see for even a human lifetime. One of the early founders of the Chestnut Foundation has his own orchard out in Minnesota, and he has planted thousands of chestnut trees. And he said that he's noticed as he leaves them for 30 or 40 years, some of the ones he predicted were the worst are now becoming the best. So even in our orchards, we're selecting for weird traits like a tree that can grow in a field, right? That's not really what they do in the. So we got to be careful, right? What we select for, and we cannot predict what other new things are going to come and try to kill our poor chestnut tree. But all trees, are always being challenged by whatever it's ash borer or whatever. There's always something trying to kill the trees, right? Humans too. Oh, not to mention humans. But there's also some light. There's some hope. Because we're a pretty small organization. We have about 325 people, and we have about 18 board members who do everything. So it means that we never have enough time to do what we really need to. But fortunately, some people have been reaching out to the next generation, because we're going to need many generations. And Tantascwa Regional School, where the tornado came through, whatever, they've actually been replanting with chestnut. And the Bristol Agricultural School has been helping store seedlings for us, and they have an orchard down there. And now we're still trying to change these new orchards, our orchards that we had, which were called seed orchards, they're sort of intercross orchards. And we're going to start just collecting Americans, just keeping Americans with Americans to try to just keep the gene pool going for when we have the magic solution. We'll be able to quickly diversify whatever we have. So we haven't been doing that much in this state. So that's, we're not too good with social media, but we do have a Facebook page. We do have a Twitter, which we don't use too much. If you go to chestnut.org, it'll send you to the national site and our site. But, we're also, the nice thing is we have noticed that it's easier to sort of organize work groups this way. So, from planning things, all of a sudden you need to do it this weekend, right? You can't wait. You can't wait 2 weekends. You have to do it at a certain time. So it's very hard. We're not good at mobilizing volunteer. So we've actually had some some good luck with the Facebook page. People actually will come and work in an orchard when you realize, oh, if I don't get these, trees planted this week, they're going to die. So that's, we're trying. We're trying, but again, we're mostly, 18 people trying to manage 50,000 seedlings or whatever. which is hard. No, it's I guess it's 2,000. Sorry, maybe 20,000 maybe. All right, that's really all I have to say. Thank you.